Everyone, and we are honored to have Dave Kollen here, and Dave is going to be, his presentation is gardening for bees and butterflies and birds. So as a Xerces Society ambassador, Dave Kollen plays a key role in pollinator education and community outreach. Additionally, he is an Oregon naturalist and master melitologist. He contributes to a number of community science projects, including the Pacific Northwest Bumblebee Atlas, the California Bumblebee Atlas, and the Oregon Bee Atlas. Dave also writes pollinator-focused articles for the Oregon State Federation of Garden Clubs newsletter, Mahonia. So without further ado, we are going to jump into Dave's presentation. Just give us one moment to do some of the changeover. And so thank you everybody for your patience.
Management operations on tens of millions of acres through our work with federal, state, and local agencies. So USDA and things like that. So they come to us to find out what best practices are to keep our invertebrates safe. So why do we care about pollinators? Okay, again, two skips. Well, 85% of flowering plants require a pollinator of some kind. And if you turn that into just, okay, all plants, that's roughly 2/3 of all plants require some kind of pollination service. And 85%, confusingly, 85% of those pollinators are in fact invertebrates. So this is normally how we get the sun's energy out into the food web, right? And you're familiar with all of these examples here. But we rely on these plants, most of which are flowering plants, to do that. So if we look at food production, a figure that's often used is 1 in 3 mouthfuls of food and drink that we consume are or require pollination services. And that's, it's a pretty good number as an average. Globally, there's something like 1,200 crops. And then the value of that is probably, more like $1 trillion now or something like that with inflation. It's kind of an old figure. Some years back, Whole Foods went and put on a demonstration to show their customers the importance of pollinators. And this is a produce section before, and this is a produce section after they removed items which relied on pollination services. So you see there's a lot of empty spots up there on the screen, and most of what's left, there's citrus and things, a lot of which, especially agriculturally, is they're selfing varieties. So they're up here, Bartlett pears probably. They did the same thing in the dairy department. This is a before, and this is an after. And you might wonder, what the heck do pollinators have to do with dairy products? Anybody know? Quick? Yes.
The food of the cows?
Right. So specifically alfalfa, because alfalfa is something that gets rotated out and needs to be reseeded. So that's why the pollinators are there. And then, it's important to remember that that's a dairy product. Most of it is. But we get a lot of other things from our pollinators. We get, cultural value from them. So things like springtime flowers and, at the end of the year, pumpkin pie for me. This is all thanks to our pollinators. I want to talk a little bit about pollinator diversity. We've got 6 major groups of pollinators: moths, or butterflies, moths, flies, wasps, bees, and beetles. And in any context, any given context, these can be more or less important than each other. But if we look in general, what we find is that bees are the most important pollinators. And there's reasons for that. But before I get there, very briefly, everybody comfortable with distinguishing a bee from a wasp if you see one out in the open? Okay, so you know that? No? Okay, generally bees are hairy. and they've got a pollen carrying structure somewhere. And they've got the wings folded over the back. A wasp, very few hairs, hold the wings apart typically, and you won't find any pollen carrying structure because they're not carrying pollen around intentionally. Bees versus flies. There are flies that look a heck of a lot like bees. You know, there's some specific flies that look like bumblebees, for instance, and I've been tricked and actually caught one and put it to chill it down, and lo and behold, it was a fly. But they've got flies have got shorter antennae, and the eyes tend to occupy a large portion of that head. Is a head ringer. In terms of the numbers of pairs of wings, you're never going to see that if they're walking around on a flower or something. And then this I just threw in here because this, believe it or not, that's a horsefly eye. It looks like a crazy pair of sunglasses, but it gives you an idea of how much of that head is occupied by the eyes. Now, bees are the most important pollinators for several reasons. Number one, they're collecting and transporting pollen. So those structures that they have, that's because they're going to take that pollen back, and that's food for their larvae. Okay, so they're not out there just buzzing around flowers and accidentally getting pollen. They're getting pollen on purpose. They forage in the area around their nest, which means they hit these same flowers over and over. And they've got something that's called flower constancy. And flower constancy means that on any given foraging bout, they tend to stick with the same species of plant. And it's not 100% thing that, you know, maybe 80% of the time they stop, it's on the same species. But if there's an abundance of that species out there, they will really stick with that. Okay. And that helps the chance of pollination. If you think about it, a butterfly goes from one species to another species and third species, and that's not how pollination works, right? And then finally, they're capable of something called buzz pollination. And buzz pollination, okay, you're plant people. You know about porosital anthers. So they're anthers that have got little slits, and you need to vibrate those at a certain frequency, and then the pollen drains are like salt coming out of a salt shaker. Certain bees, maybe 40, 50% of them are capable of, they bite onto these stamens, and then they vibrate their flight muscles without moving their wings. And they do it at just the right frequency to set that salt shaker off, and they collect that pollen typically on their bellies and take it away. The sonication is another word for that. Now, these pollen carrying structures, I want to just show you. Here on this bumblebee, we see a large lump of pollen on the rear leg. And that structure that carries that, there's a shiny flat surface, and then you've got these long hairs around it so that it can pack this moistened pollen down in there. It's moistened with nectar. And, you know, this is a full load, and you can see here where it's just starting to pack this, it's the tibia, starting to pack that tibia up, and then it'll fill it up towards the front there. So we talked about the hind legs. There's another type of bee, a family of bees that typically carry pollen on the underside of the abdomen. And they've got these structures are called a pollen brush. It's a scopa is the scientific name. And so they've got an abdominal scopa. And if you see these bees, sometimes they're patting the bottom of their abdomen on the flower as they're walking around on it. So honeybees, I'm not going to say much about those because number one, we deal with natives, and honeybees are not native. They're brought over by the colonists, and they're not typical in any way. So honeybees are in, you know, colonies of tens of thousands of bees. They're a fascinating creature, but we're not going to talk about them tonight. So one thing I will add, though, is that, you know, they're extremely important for agricultural reasons. Most of you would be aware of that, obviously. And they do have their problems, with disease and different things like that. So I'm going to focus on native bees. Most native bees are solitary. Something like 90% of native bees are solitary bees. They're very gentle. And they're very unlikely to sting for two reasons. Number one, because they have no reason to want to have battle with you. Okay, because if they do and they get killed, then they can't reproduce. And they don't have a colony to protect, unlike, say, a bumblebee or honeybees and some others. And then the second thing is that the smaller bees, their sting is so weak that I'm actually talking about the stinger is so weak that a lot of times these small bees can't get it in through your skin. And so kids will play around with sometimes these little bees called andrena, mining bees, and they call them tickle bees because they just tickle them. If we look at bee diversity in terms of numbers of species, worldwide, there's something like 20,000 species of bees. In the United States, or I should say US and Canada, north of Mexico, there's somewhere 3,600 to 4,000 species of bees. We're still finding them, still looking. Oregon and Washington, we have somewhere in the neighborhood of 600 to 800, closer to 800 now, through work that's been done, say, with the Oregon Bee Atlas to get out there and identify things. A city the size of Portland might have 100 to 150 species of bees in that city. And then finally, your own yard, you could have 30 or 40 species of bees if you've got good pollinator habitat with flowers through the seasons, basically. And you may not know that there are 30 or 40 different species of bees, but you could have them. One aspect of diversity is just the difference in size that we have. So this big giant part of a black head that you see is something called a valley carpenter bee. And then the little inset is a bee called a perdita. Some people call them fairy bees. And so you can see this giant difference in size. And both of these happen to coexist in southeastern California area, where you start to get into some of the desert areas there. Talk a little bit about the natural history of bees. So adult bees, so we're going to start here with a mining bee, which is typical of a solitary bee, and what we call the kind of the floor plan for bees. So what I'm saying here is that very early on in their evolution, they were ground nesters always. And when the solitary female emerges, she mates, and then she's going to have a lifespan of maybe 2 to 4 weeks. 4 weeks at the most, and that's it. And so during that time, she's got to gather pollen and provision nest. And here we have a very simple example of a ground nesting bee nest. The pollen she gathers, she's going to work it together into something called bee bread, people call it, but it's a pollen provision. And that's this, yellowish orange thing on the bottom here. And she will then lay an egg on that and cap this off. She'll fill this up with soil so no predators or parasites get in there. That egg's going to hatch over 1 to 3 weeks, depending on the species. And then bees go through 5 larval stages. And that occurs again over some variable period of time, depending on species. And then typically, bees are going to overwinter in what's called a pre-pupa stage. So they spin a cocoon around themselves and they just wait to pupate. And they can be in the ground for 8 or 9 months like that. And some desert bees, where they have an ability to last for years in case there's bad conditions out there, they can be underground for 2 or 3 years. Now, at this point, I want to just bring up this little animal here called a cuckoo bee. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but this cuckoo bee is named after a cuckoo bird. They're parasites, brood parasites. And so this bee sneaks down into the nest and lays its own egg. And when that egg hatches, that little hatchling will hatch they quickly, and they've got these giant pincers, and if they see any movement, they will kill it. And so they effectively get rid of the host egg or larvae that are there, and then steal this provision for themselves. So that's what a cuckoo bee is. So bees, you know, what do they need? Well, they need access to soil if they're ground nesting bees. Above ground, a lot of times they look like little anthills, but you can see on the right, things can get fairly complex. This is a communal nest where multiple females are sharing the entrance, but they're not doing any work. So it's not anything cooperative going on there. Think of it as being kind of a condominium. Some of our solitary bees are, so 70% are ground nesters, 30% are cavity nesters. And the cavity nesters will go into an existing, say, a beetle tunnel in wood, or if they find maybe a crack in a wall, a brick wall or something like that. Also, if there's a pithy stem, so a plant that's got something that they can excavate out, they'll go and do that and then create this linear row of cells, brood cells. And so what was happening underground before is now transferred to above ground in here. She starts at one end and starts, you know, gathers pollen, lays an egg, closes it off with some plant fiber, and continues to the end of that stem. You can see here, there's various materials that are used. It's typically all going to be leaf materials or mud. You might be wondering about that center picture. Well, here's a silver, it's a petal cutter, they call it. Silver-tailed petal cutter is the common name of this bee. And you can see it is on, Clarkia. It's on a Clarkia species of some kind. It's cut one of those petals off, and then she's going to go and carry that back and use that to build this. She lines the inside of that stem with that. So in terms of nest materials, we've got, you know, leaf pieces. Some bees use pebbles and plant resins. Mason bees, they use mud, hence the name mason bee. And then finally, some bees use the trichomes on plants. So, you know, what would come to mind is, say, an elephant ear, which, you know, no one in a native plant society cares about elephant. I keep saying that, lamb's ear. No one here cares about lamb's ear, but we got a bee that called Anthidium manicatum that's an invasive that grew up with this over in Europe, right? And so but we've got our own versions of this. So they scrape these hairs, they go into that cavity, and they line that cavity with their hairs, and then they put their pollen and lay an egg in the center of that. Bumblebees. The bumblebee life cycle, totally different. So solitary bees, remember, adults 2 to 4 weeks. Bumblebees, the queen is going to be alive for a full year. And they're going to go through that life cycle. Over in the wintertime, she was born last year. This time of year, she is going to be, especially here, she's going to be in something called a hibernaculum, which is she'll either dig into the ground or under a thick cover of leaves to protect her from the weather. And then in the springtime, she will emerge and start to look for nectar to replenish her energy stores. Much like grizzly bears, queens fatten up in the previous fall. They've got something called fat bodies in them. And so they burn through that. And the ones that burn through it early, they die. They don't survive to form a colony. But for the ones that do, after they get tanked up, they go and they try to find a place to create a colony, a nest. And around here, most of our bees are ground nesting bees. So they're going to try to find an existing rodent den, I should say an old rodent den that's got insulation in it, which is perfect for them. And she goes out and gets ready for laying her egg. And the first thing she does is she creates a wax pot that's called a nectar pot and honey pot, sorry, and fills it with nectar. And she, she's gathering this, bringing it back, regurgitating it, spends a lot of time. This takes a lot of time to do this. Then she goes out and gathers a big lump of pollen. When she's got both of these, she goes and lays eggs, usually 8 legs at the beginning on that pollen. And she sits there much like a bird and incubates those eggs to help them develop faster. And the honey pot's there so that she doesn't have to keep going out and getting something for her energy replenishment. It takes a lot of energy to do this. And every trip outside, pardon? We're going to get there. Is that okay? Can I just go through here? Okay. I don't want to spoil the surprise. So after 5 to 6 weeks, that first batch of eggs is going to hatch. And then she's got workers. After that, she will never leave that colony again. But her job is to lay more eggs. And there's going to be several successive generations of workers raised. Again, depending on the species, will determine how long that goes on. But somewhere in late summer, early fall, something called colony changeover occurs. And when this happens, from that point on, the larvae are raised as reproductives. So the queen has in her control whether to lay male or female eggs. So she switches to starting to produce both males and females, but the workers feed the females a lot more goodies. And so they grow up and they're oversized and they're going to be the queens for the next year. Mating is going on right here. So after those reproductives leave, so this is going to be in the fall when this happens. Again, it depends on the species because they come, this happens with different timing. But let's just say in the fall. And then after that, the females then are going to go eventually after fattening up, they're going to go into a hibernaculum. And the males are going to hang around until they either run out of flowers or they get killed off in the first freeze. That's what happens. So bumblebees, in terms of habitat, they like kind of messy areas. As I told you, they're going to, if they're looking for a rodent den that's got a very noticeable entrance hole in it, they like that hidden so that predators like skunks and things can't come and dig out the nest, which is very rich in protein. If we look, at bumblebees or bees in general, if we look at their needs in terms of flowers, there's really 2 things, and I've mentioned them both. One of them is nectar, one of them is pollen. So nectar, they don't care where that comes from, right? Any flower that they can access the nectaries and get nectar, that's good. When it comes to pollen, because certain plants, the pollen can be toxic to the larvae. So things that happen through evolutionary time where we've got to where we have some bees that are generalists that are can take a broad variety of different plant pollens. And then we've got specialists. And a lot of times the specialists are actually working with plants that really have a toxic load like death camas or something like that. And so I think there's like one bee that can deal with death camas. It's a little mining bee species. Butterflies. The butterfly life cycle is very much like bees, only instead of making a nest, butterflies lay their eggs on a host plant. And, they're not given any protection to those eggs, so they lay a heck of a lot of eggs so that there'll be some survivors through that process. And that's just one of those trade-offs in, Biology. Everybody understand or I want to make sure you understand the difference. So host plants versus nectar plants, kind of like the bees, nectar plants, whatever's got nectar, that's a nectar plant and it works. Host plants, they are for a lot of butterflies, they're fairly specific. They're kind of like those specialist bees, right? And everybody knows about monarchs and milkweed, but that repeats over and over and over again. So it's a very common thing. One other difference is that butterflies can overwinter in the egg stage. No bees overwinter as eggs. So I want to go back to this picture. I didn't spend much time earlier, and I want to focus on these caterpillars up here. Caterpillars transfer more energy into the food web than any other animal. That's just a fact. Amazing. And another fact is that most birds, given the chance, they prefer to forage within about 50 yards of their nest. They don't have to, go on long flights, leave the babies unattended, etc. So if you like having birds in your yard, then what do you need to do? Think about getting some food in there. And how do you do that? You put in host plants for your local butterflies and moths. And there's, I've got some material back here, but one of them is, plants for pollinators. And if you look at the icons on there, it'll tell you which of these plants on the list are good larval host plants. And I forgot to say that. Please, I brought all this stuff down here. It's meant to be, taken away and go for it. So let's look at threats. Habitat loss, no big surprise there. Pesticides. We apply more than 1 billion pounds of pesticides a year in the US. 1 billion. And when I use that term pesticides, it's an umbrella, right? It's not, a lot of people use that to mean insecticide. Well, no, it's insecticides, fungicides, miticides, whatever. One of the worst things about pesticide use in us people is that a lot of it's used for cosmetic purposes. Somebody finds a few holes in a plant and they want to spray down the whole yard with some kind of insecticide. And, it's bad on a number of levels. And I'll leave it at that because I'm trying to get through this thing for you. This is a bumblebee kill-off that happened up in Wilsonville in 2013. Bottom line on this is somebody applied legally some systemic pesticides to some linden trees, and the result was 100 to 150,000 bumblebees died during a 2-week period of time. And so these are insecticides that were injected into the trunk. They went up through the vascular system and finally got into the nectar. No, there's things that happen beyond, that are more subtle than death, if I want to put it that way. So there's these things, sublethal effects. And one of the things that happens with pesticide exposure that's at a low level is reproductive success is, lessened. Okay. So it affects their ability to, reproduce as they might if they weren't exposed for a number of different pathways. Growth is another thing. Neem oil is something that a lot of people think is okay, right? What's wrong with a little oil on your tree? Well, it's okay as long as it doesn't get onto a flower and carried back to a larvae in a nest, because it is a growth regulator, right? And so what happens is the larvae will not develop as rapidly as it normally would, and it's going to be a little runt bee. And runt bees are not very successful bees. The immune system can be affected by things, especially fungicides. Like us, they've got a gut microbiome, and the fungicides impact that. Their immune response lowers, and so they're more susceptible to parasites and diseases. And then finally, in foraging, it's been shown that sometimes bees lose their way after being exposed to small amounts of pesticide. So they just like fly off into the sunset, never to be seen again. So that's the safest amount of pesticides. None. Climate change, well, there's a lot I could say, and I won't because that's like a separate lecture. But one thing that I will say is that, you know, there's two components of that. There's this longer term change that happens maybe over decades, but then just as important, maybe more importantly in certain times, is this kind of extreme variability, these extreme events that occur, because these are capable of wiping out populations. If you imagine monarch groves down in Southern California, and what happens if you get 2 or 3 really wet Pacific storms coming through in a series, it can just take out a whole grove and then they're gone forever. And there's more and more of these things. So I've talked about these threats, and what do we see? Well, we see declines, declines, declines. And I mentioned that, you know, these invertebrates, they're part of many food webs. So Audubon, their bird counts, if you look at the difference in the last 50 years, the number of birds counted was down by like 25%. It ends up being something like 3 billion birds, but it's a 25% drop. And for those that are insectivores, they're bearing the brunt of this. And then the ones that are seed eaters and things, they're not. They're kind of stable. So what does that take us to? Well, that takes us to conservation, because that's how you deal with these threats. And we have 4 principles. Appropriate foraging. Don't use pesticides. We want to give nesting, overwintering, and sheltering sites. And then finally, you know, spread the word, be an advocate. I want to make sure everybody understands. Once in a while, somebody will come up to me and say, you know, I'm going to put in some honeybees because I really want to help the bees. And I have to say, you know, for God's sakes, if you want to help the bees, don't put in a honeybee hive, give them the right kind of habitat, because at best, honeybees are neutral. Okay, worse, they can bring diseases and they can outcompete under certain contexts. They can outcompete our natives for pollen resources and nectar if there's not enough to go around. So what honeybees are is this. They're, you know, example of just a domestic agriculture. And if you want to have a nest so you can have your own honey, great, do that. But don't do it because you want to save the bees. So what is a good habitat? Well, secure nest sites, plenty of foraging, and that means over the seasons, because remember, bumblebees are out for, you know, from kind of late winter, early spring, all the way through fall, and they need a pesticide-free environment. Now, a lot of us live in, you know, urban, suburban areas, and, you know, these are our habitats, examples of some of these unnatural areas that we live in. I'm not counting our yards here. And, you know, these may or may not be good. You have to do a survey and find out. But you can get a lot out of these partial habitats. Here we have an example of a ground nesting bee, and I'm not going to go through all these details, but if it loops around this neighborhood, it can pick up various things that it needs at different locations. And so everything works out. So obviously it's found a nest site in this yard. So that's okay. You don't have to provide everything. You can provide part of what's needed. So appropriate flowers and host plants, 50 to 60% ideally should be natives. And when we're putting them in, you know, we're thinking about bloom period again. Like I said, of the bumblebees, you full spread spectrum across the seasons. And remember that these solitary bees, they come out at different times from spring all the way through fall. So they need to have flowers when they come out. You want to have a diversity of flower types, flower shapes. I'll show you on the next slide here. And then, of course, drought tolerance is something that we want to think of, and natives help us on that if they're really native to our region. You know that, it's just part of my talk. So here, I've got some examples of different flower morphologies. And this bee here in the center, or center left, is a mining bee. And it's got a short tongue. So that little tongue right here. And that bee has no trouble getting nectar from this rose, this sunflower family plant. Perfect, no problem. Gonna have a heck of a time getting into some of these long corolla flowers. This bee, on the other hand, it's hard to see the tongue. So I put this little red line in here to show you the length of that tongue. That tongue's almost as large as the bee's body, long as the bee's body. And so that bee, well, if it's on this flower, it's gonna be walking on its tongue, right? And so it's gonna wanna get into some of these deeper corollas. So, bees have different morphologies, and that's why we need to have a diversity of plants if we wanna have a diversity of bees. And then finally, while you're at it, why not kill two birds with one stone? Well, okay, bad metaphor, but think of some things that lay berries or seeds behind for the birds in the wintertime. When you're planting up front, just keep that in mind. Butterflies, I mentioned earlier, you need to have larval host plants. Those are always going to be regional. And, look at a good list from somebody to see what that is in your area. Keystone plants, much like the keystone in this arch, they're just really critical for supporting our ecosystems locally, the wildlife. And it's been shown that there's just a minority of plant genera that support the vast majority of pollinators and other invertebrates. If we look at prunus, over the range of prunus, there's 340 different caterpillar species that use that as a host plant. You look at solidago, almost 50 species of caterpillars and a little over 40 species of specialist bees. And remember, these are these finicky eaters that I talked about earlier. So this solidago is a great plant to have. And then 96% of terrestrial birds rely on invertebrates, and mostly caterpillars, at some stage during their life. Usually it's as nestlings, they're getting fed that. So this plant guide for Maritime Northwest is sitting out in back here, and help yourself. Garden plants, they're okay, chosen carefully. Exotics, I'm saying, that's kind of normal garden plants. Rosemary is a great little plant for pollinators, right? I've got a couple of them. And they're full of bumblebees. Talamy points out it's not the presence of non-native plants that's really a problem with our food web. It's when you don't have the native plants there as a base. These double-petaled flowers, which I'm sure you're familiar with, rose being a good example. I'm sure you all know how you get from this one in the bottom over to this one, mutations that have been carefully curated over, for roses, hundreds of years. And what you end up with is something that a bee doesn't know what the heck to do with that, right? Because they don't carry crowbars around with them. So, they're just like, avoid them. Milkweed, it's not really a problem here, but because of the freezing. But tropical milkweed, you really just want to stay away from that. It's Kurosavica, I think is what it is. That thing can host a parasitic organism, big old long name. OE is the shortened version of that. And what ends up, and that can be carried over by the adult, and it gets and infects the larvae, and then the newly pupated butterflies. And this is an example of a butterfly that suffers from this disease. This butterfly will never fly because they're severely deformed wings from this parasite. So, you know, if you have it and you don't want to yank it out of the ground, at least cut it back to the ground in the wintertime and then bag the debris and put it in trash can. So again, just to reiterate, native is best, and you want to have coverage from these kind of early, you know, willows and things all the way through we get to when we get to our asters that typically are coming out in the fall. Lawns, nothing pretty about this. Bees hate them. And in the US, they take up, they're equivalent to a state the size of Kansas. And so, you know, one thing you can do is think about putting in something like an eco lawn. And you can even overseed to do something like this. Another thing is a little pocket meadow. This is more than pocket meadow, but you know, you can do tastefully put in a pocket meadow and mow around the thing so that your neighbors don't go crazy during the summertime. And you know, it's a nice little thing to have. And then finally, just apply benign neglect. Just let part of it go. That's what I do. I let stuff, I have patches of flowers all summer long and it drives my wife nuts, but that's just the way it is. Pesticides. If you have to use them, then use them carefully. Read the labels. You don't ever use more than you need to. Don't apply them when the plant's flowering, or make sure you don't get it on a flower. Don't apply it haphazardly, because remember ground nesting bees. You might be putting pesticide down into a ground nesting bee hole. And then just remember those sublethal effects I talked about. Systemic pesticides, neonicotinoids, most of you probably know about. You know, if you're buying plants at a nursery, make sure you know what you're buying. Ask them if they're treated either by them or their suppliers with systemics. Systemics even in an herbaceous plant could stick around for 2 or 3 months. In woody plants, they can be around for 2 or 3 years. So be careful with those. So I'm telling you, skip the pesticides, right? So what are you going to do? Well, if you create a more diverse ecosystem in your yard, it's going to be more resilient. It's going to be resilient against pests. Doesn't mean it's going to work 100%, but you know, you learn to tolerate a little bit of damage. It means something's used in your yard. And the other thing is that, you know, pests are only about 2% of the species. Now, it's easy for me to tell you that when the 2% are wreaking havoc in your yard, but keep it in the back of your mind. And put, excuse me, put the right plant in the right place. So, you know, you don't want to start out with a plant that's living suboptimally, expect it to be able to fight off the pest, even the pests that it grew up with. And then the natives, what's one of the benefits of natives? Native plants have co-evolved with the pests, I'm going to use the pests, but species that want to eat them, put it that way. And over that time, it's an arms race. And so those plants have created toxins, and they're kind of a little bit of a, you know, one side wins, the other side wins, but it doesn't go crazy. You go walk out into a natural area, you don't see trees totally defoliated unless it's an invasive that got in, because our plants haven't evolved to deal with it. Nesting, egg laying, and shell overwintering sites. You know, some of the things, snags are great for cavity nesting bees. If you can keep them safely, do it. Ground nesting bees need areas of soil. You don't have to have this big old chunk of soil like this in this picture. And if you have trouble, you know, creating areas like this in your yard, You can go get a little helper like I have, and you know, he creates areas like this for me all the time. This is about a square foot in my backyard. And each one of these circles is a mining bee nest. So they don't need much room. I think there's actually 7 nests there. One of them doesn't have a circle on it, but that's in a square foot. So, you know, leave a little spot somewhere and then do what you want with the rest of it, but just leave some patches here and there. Tunnel nesting bees, I've got a handout that covers this in more detail. And so, you know, with time restrictions and such, I'm going to leave it. But pithy plants, if you leave those stems, bees can use those for, you know, creating those rows of nests that I showed you, brood cells that I showed you. So this is the handout. Please take them. Nest blocks. This is one thing you can do for cavity nesting bees. You've probably seen these. They work. You want to make sure they're deep enough, because sometimes you buy something online, it may only be 2 inches deep, and that's pretty much worthless. But they do work. And if you look at them, you can tell what's using them. So here we see green plant materials that are masticated to stop up those chambers. And that's a leafcutter bee. And then below that, mud mason bee. You help more than bees. So this is a grass carrying wasp, I guess what they call it. And it actually clips this grass out somewhere in the field, flies back with it, and uses that in creating its brood cells. Leave the leaves. This is a campaign. Short story is that if you can find a way that you can live with to keep some leaves in your yard, maybe under a hedge or something like that. There's not only bumblebee queens, but there's just a plethora of butterflies and all kinds of other invertebrates that this is critical for them to survive through the winter. And so try to do this. If you go to Xerces.org, go over to resources, go to Resource Conservation Center. Oops, sorry, went too far. And then you can select a region, here, Pacific Northwest, obviously. And what happens is you get these bars that come up. And if you click on them, there's a list of materials that you can download under each one of those bars. And some examples here on the right. More examples of things that you can just download from the Xerces website. And it's just an enormous amount of information out there for you. Oh, crap. There we go. Sorry. So enormous amount of information out there. I think I'm late for something. Xerces has some really good books. And Attracting Native Pollinators is a really good core book. And these other ones are good too. So by now, you've gotten a little bit shortened version, but most people are tired of me by now. It's like, is this guy ever going to stop talking? And I will, just a minute. So we've all seen this. If they build it, or if we build it, if you build it, okay, I'm getting tired. They will come. And so nothing is more true of that statement than a pollinator garden, right? Or just your backyard ecosystem, because it's up to you to decide what it is you want to end up with at the end of the day. And so that's in your control. So there was a 4th conservation principle, and that was spread the word. And so we want you to be an advocate. If you're on social media and you're doing things for pollinators, post it, talk about it. You can put up signs to let your neighbors know, start conversations, let people know what's going on. I've done this with my neighbors. Other things you can do, I've got a brochure back here on Bring Back the Pollinators. You can go and, basically register your yard if you pledge to follow these principles. The X Kids program is a really good thing for kids. And it says grades 3 to 5. It's actually broader than that. It's more sophisticated than you might think. And it's an activity booklet that's really good. So if you've got kids or grandkids, there's a bunch of them back there. Take them. I want them empty so my crate's lighter when I carry it out of here. Community science. If you've got the time and the interest, there are a lot of different projects you can get involved with. You can do bee atlas stuff like I do. There's monarch, milkweed mapper, just a number of things going on. You can volunteer locally, people that are doing restoration, work like flowers to flowers. What is it, Christina? Christina's always looking for help, but there's land conservancy groups, others that, can use help. So if you can't do it in your yard, you can do it in other ways. I remind you of this license plate that's available. Started last year was the first year. Part of the proceeds from this go to fund basic bee research at OSU. And both of my vehicles now have this. Xerces has a podcast called Bug Banter, really interesting. Variety of topics, not just about bees. And some pretty fascinating stuff. Look it up. I couldn't even tell you how many YouTube videos, but there's some really great videos there. Probably 100 or so. And if you're on social media, Xerces is there. Finally, we are a member-based organization. We're always looking for new members. Now, I've got a sign-up sheet, not to be a new member. Okay, no pressure. But it's a free e-newsletter, and it's a really good e-newsletter. And so you're not going to get spammed or anything like that. But I'd invite you to learn more about the work Xerces is doing. And maybe you consider becoming a member later on after you read it and you see that. But, please, if you're at all interested, use that sign-up sheet. So that's it. Thank you very much. I don't know how I came out on time. I tried.
Anyway, I'll route to the herbarium now, and anybody wants to stay here and talk to him. Here, lead on, lead on.
Yeah, we could do that if you want.
Okay.
I'd like to hear what people are asking, but that's okay.
Do you have any questions?
Interesting time.
Yeah, does anybody have any questions?
There's one on Zoom,
Just
Okay.
one question.
but you can ask people to decide. We've got one in the room. One or two questions.
Where is the question?
In the comments, or the chat.
So the question is, might a queen ever venture out on a warm winter day and then return to
Naculum.
hibernaculum to successfully ride it out till spring?
Okay, so the answer to that question is there are in fact overwintering bumblebees. Well, we distinguish that from hibernating bumblebees. If it's warm enough, like on the coast where I live, we do have bees that don't go into hibernation. And so they will ride out, 5 or 6 days, 10 days of really terrible weather. And then they pop back out there, but they're sheltering somewhere as opposed to actually going into diapause. When they hibernate, they actually go into diapause, and that's kind of a 2 or 3 day process to do that. So you just don't go in and out of that. And they seem to, survive. I've tracked them over the winters. And so, I saw 3 different species of bees a couple of weeks ago. So they will do that in a warm enough environment.
All right.
Yes.
What I know best is butterflies, and of course, many of them are very, very fussy about the specific host plants. And by the way, I call those, baby food for caterpillars. A lot of butterflies are not very good dispersers. And there are plants up on the Siskiyou Crest that are very productive out there. I'm pretty darn sure I could put all of those plants in my garden down on the valley floor here, and the butterflies wouldn't find them.
Yeah, I mean, you could be absolutely
And
right.
I'm just wondering, is it the same way with the bees and the hoverflies and so on?
Yeah, so, bee dispersal, it varies kind of with one of the big factors is the size. Because that really determines, even when they're foraging, how far they're going out and foraging. So really small bees may only go 30 meters. The very smallest bee, maybe not much outside of the room, if they had a little nest in the center here. And then, bumblebees, maybe 300-500 yards, they could go up to a mile. Honeybees, I think they're recorded up to 9 or 10 miles away. So, it depends on, but in general, they're much stronger flyers than a butterfly is, right? Bees. So I think bee dispersal in general is going to be greater than for butterflies, with the caveat that it depends on the size of the species typically.
Sure.
All right, one more question. Do you know the genus or family of the death camas bee?
Oh, man. Oh, the death canvas bee, yeah, it's Andrena astragalli, I think. The family's Andrenidae. Subfamily obviously is Andreninae, Andrena, and I think, what did I just say? My brain's tired. Astragalus, I think, or something like that.
Okay. Well, thanks, Dave, for the wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
And thank you, everybody, for being here tonight. And we look forward to seeing you next month. And thanks again, everybody.
Okay.